Fable 5 and Mythos 5 are off the global market, and the most important question isn't whether the administration was right, it's who's already on the phone with Anthropic's displaced customers. Every piece you've read this week has been the Anthropic versus Washington story, the political fight, the legal exposure, the founder's response. And look, that story is real. But it's the wrong frame if you're trying to understand what actually happens next in the AI market. Because when a major frontier model provider gets knocked off the board in a significant slice of the global market, the contracts don't disappear. The demand doesn't disappear, it just moves. And right now it is moving fast, and it's moving toward people who are very prepared to catch it. So tonight I want to set the political drama mostly aside and treat this as what it also is, a market structure event. A forced redistribution of enterprise AI spend at a moment when several competitors were already positioning for exactly this kind of opening. To understand the size of the gap, you have to map what Anthropic actually had in place before this landed. There's the enterprise API layer, which is significant on its own. Companies across financial services, legal tech, and healthcare had built workflows on Claude. Those contracts represent real, locked-in spend. But the more striking piece is the carrier distribution pipeline. The SK Telecom partnership was the headline deal here, a relationship that, according to reporting, represented access to roughly 500 million users across SK Telecom's footprint. That is not a niche deployment. That is the kind of distribution that lets a frontier model become ambient infrastructure for an entire country's smartphone ecosystem. And then there's the quieter signal that I think practitioners should be paying close attention to, Claude's new identity verification gating, the KYC requirement that rolled out recently. On the surface, it looks like a compliance measure, and it probably is partly that. But the timing is hard to read as coincidental. When a company starts tightening access controls right as regulatory pressure peaks, that's usually a company that's anticipating further action and trying to demonstrate good faith compliance before it's mandated. The practical effect for anyone building on Claude's API is that the access surface just got smaller and more conditional than it was 6 months ago. So you've got disrupted enterprise contracts, a collapsed carrier-scale distribution deal, and tightening access controls on the API itself. That's the gap. And it's a big one. The SK Telecom deal is the cleanest case study here because the scale makes the competitive math visible. A carrier-level AI integration at that user count is exactly the kind of contract that transforms a model provider from a tool you use into infrastructure you depend on. It's distribution that compounds. Every developer building on top of SK Telecom's platform, every enterprise customer running their back end on it, every consumer product layered over it. They all inherit a dependency on whichever model sits at the bottom of that stack. Losing that slot doesn't just cost Anthropic one customer. It cost them an entire ecosystem that was forming around their model. Now, according to reporting from TechCrunch and The Verge, this is not a slot that sat empty for long. OpenAI and Google DeepMind have both been active in exactly this space. The timing of Google's Gemini real-time speech capabilities launch, and OpenAI's aggressive enterprise hiring that's been tied to its IPO positioning. These aren't unrelated to a major competitor suddenly becoming distribution constrained. You don't need a conspiracy theory to explain it, you just need to understand that enterprise sales teams at well-capitalized companies watch their competitors' regulatory exposure very carefully. And there's a geopolitical dimension to this that goes beyond the immediate competitive picture. Chinese labs have been trying for years to establish themselves as the credible alternative to U.S. frontier models in markets that are either non-aligned or actively skeptical of Washington. Every time a U.S. administration action makes a U.S. lab look like an unreliable partner, it hands those labs a narrative they couldn't buy. "We don't have export controls on our models," is a powerful pitch in markets where continuity of access matters. Okay, so let me steelman the administration's position here because I think the honest version of it is stronger than most of the coverage gives it credit for. The underlying concern driving export controls on frontier AI models is not crazy. The argument is roughly this: sufficiently capable models, once they're in the hands of an adversary, can accelerate weapons research, undermine intelligence operations, and enable things that are genuinely hard to reverse. And the people making that argument are not wrong. The technical guardrails are not unbreakable. Safety training and constitutional AI methods are meaningful, but they're not a lock. A determined state actor with access to a capable model has options that a responsible lab can't fully close off from the outside. But here's where the policy runs into a real technical problem, and it's one that almost nobody in the coverage has been precise about. Export controls on model weights and export controls on API access are categorically different enforcement challenges. If you've got the weights, you can fine-tune away safety training, run the model in an air-gapped environment, do whatever you want. If you've only got API access, the provider sits in the middle and can pull the plug. The policy, as applied to Anthropic's API-based distribution deals like the SK Telecom partnership, is treating these as equivalent, and they're not. You can make a real argument for restricting weight distribution to certain jurisdictions. The argument for restricting API access to allied telecoms is considerably weaker because you haven't actually reduced the adversary's capability, you just hurt the US company. So the concern isn't baseless, the application is a different question. So where does all of this leave us? I think the Seoul office is the most honest signal of where Anthropic's strategy is actually headed, and it's worth taking seriously. Opening a physical office in Korea right in the middle of this fight is not a coincidence, and it's not just PR. It's a bet on a specific thesis that allied but not US markets, Korea, the EU, Japan, potentially others, can sustain Anthropic's deployment ambitions even if Washington keeps narrowing what's permissible under US jurisdiction. The company is, essentially, beginning to route around its home government. And given the constraints it's operating under, that's probably the right call strategically. But here's what that means for the broader industry, and this is the part I find genuinely interesting to think about. We're watching the early stages of AI market fragmentation along sovereign lines. Not because any one government planned it that way, but because the combination of US export controls, EU AI Act compliance requirements, and China's own domestic AI regulations is carving the global market into zones. And Anthropic's situation right now is a preview of what that fragmentation feels like from the inside of a lab that's trying to serve a global enterprise customer base. The safety versus capability balance question also gets complicated here in a way that doesn't get enough attention. Anthropic's whole institutional identity is built around being the safety-first lab. If Washington's actions end up shrinking Anthropic's market share and revenue base while competitors with lighter safety commitments pick up the displaced contracts, the net effect on the industry's safety posture isn't obviously positive. You can believe the export controls are well-intentioned and still notice that the competitive redistribution they're causing may not serve the goal they're nominally advancing. For practitioners, here's where I'd focus your attention this week. If Claude is load-bearing in your stack, right now is a genuinely good time to audit your single-vendor exposure. Not because Anthropic is going away, I don't think that's the scenario here, but because the conditions that produce this disruption are probably going to produce more of it. Geopolitical risk is now part of your model dependency calculus in a way that it frankly wasn't 18 months ago. Which parts of your pipeline are Claude only? What's the fallback? Do your SLA guarantees survive a forced access revocation that isn't Anthropic's fault? Watch what happens with the SK Telecom slot specifically. Whoever lands that carrier-scale contract will tell you a lot about where enterprise AI distribution power is concentrating. And watch Anthropic's allied market moves, Korea first. But if the EU and Japan follow, that's a company that's figured out how to operate as a multinational AI lab with a complicated relationship with its home government. That's a new kind of institution, and it'll be worth understanding. That's your evening context. See you tomorrow.